We have never experienced anything like this in the history of our energy industry.
Plummeting oil prices are delivering a staggering blow to Alberta's economy, reaching record lows this week before regaining some ground on Thursday. So, what should Albertans make of this market volatility, and how big of a toll might it end up taking? Joining us now, Richard Masson, Chair of World Petroleum Congress Canada. Richard, let's start on the current price. West Texas and Brent crude rallied a bit Thursday before giving those gains back early today. What's that movement in the price over the past 24, 48 hours reflecting?
The market is just so uncertain. We have the double whammy of the COVID-19 production issues. You know, can you keep your wells going? Will you be able to sell anything? What's this doing to global demand? And we also have the big challenge that's going on right now between Russia and Saudi Arabia as they enter an all-out price war looking for better market share. So Alberta's facing a huge double whammy right now. And as the oil tanks fill up with too much production and not enough demand, it's going to probably get worse before it gets better.
Okay, so most understand that demand is down because of the coronavirus. But why is there this price war between Saudi Arabia and Russia?
Well, if you go back a couple of weeks ago, the thought was if they could cut production by about 1.5 million barrels a day, and right now in the world we produce around 100 million barrels a day, so that was like a 1.5% cut. The thought was if they could do that, that would balance the market. And Saudi Arabia said, we'll cut 1 million if Russia, you cut 500,000. And Russia said, no, we're not going to do that. Saudi Arabia said, well, if you're not going to play ball with us anymore, we are going to start pumping oil. We'll pump an extra 2.5 million barrels a day, and we'll make you feel the pain. And Russia was okay with that because they're really concerned about all the extra production that has come out of the U.S. U.S. has increased its production 6-7 million barrels a day in the last few years and taken market share from both of them. So that was what people thought at the beginning of this whole crisis was the demand would be impacted, but it wouldn't be too big. Of late, given all the lockdowns in all the countries of the world, I've seen an estimate from Goldman Sachs that demand is actually being cut by about 8 million barrels a day right now, and that's just huge. It's Saudi Arabia had been producing about 10, Russia had been producing about 10. So to think that global demand has cut by 8, it's a bigger problem than either of them can handle, and that's why we have this huge uncertainty facing the oil industry, because how long will it take to come back to balance?
Okay, so the compounding effect means what for a barrel of oil produced here in Alberta?
Well, we have our own unique challenges because we're landlocked. We've already, everybody knows, we have a limited pipeline capacity, very limited storage capacity. So now Saudi Arabia is flooding the world with oil. There's less demand, and so the tanks down in the Gulf Coast are filling up. There's not enough place to put the refined products that nobody's using. That's backing it up to Cushing, which is backing it up to Hardisty, which is putting more and more pressure on Alberta's oil situation. We just don't have any place to store the oil we're producing. So that's why you saw Western Canadian Select below $10, the lowest price ever this week.
Okay, so what kind of options are Alberta producers then left with?
Well, the operating costs are above the cost, the value that they're getting for their oil. So those who can shut in oil will probably be doing that right now. So conventional oil wells are relatively easier to shut in. Big oil sands projects are difficult because they're complex. They have a lot of fixed costs. You've got to worry about damaging the reservoirs so that you don't get as much production later. If you're a big mine and you've got an upgrader, how do you mothball all of that, especially in the winter? It's very expensive. And so companies are looking at all these contingency plans right now. We need to lower production because we have limited places to put the oil, but it's very difficult, costly, and it takes time.
Any idea on how much production could be shut in? Because there was word today in one instance, Athabasca Oil curtailing production by about 25%, cutting capital spending as well, I understand about $30 million. All told, how much is not going to be produced?
Well, what we know going into this year is companies had intended to spend between conventional oil and oil sands about $31 billion of capital spending. We've already heard announced cuts of $4.5 billion, and more companies are cutting each day. So that's a big additional impact. But that means no drilling, so that means no production later this year. In terms of what could get cut right away, difficult to know, but I would expect, we could see 100, 200, 300,000 barrels a day of near-term cuts between some of the conventional production and some of the heavy oil wells. I haven't ever in my career in 30 years seen a major oil sands project get mothballed in one of these crises, but this time is different because the outlook is prices might not improve anytime soon, and so companies could think about doing that.
Okay, well, so if this market environment is sustained for any length of time, if it goes beyond 2020, how likely are Canadian producers to survive it?
Well, this is where we're going to have the weak and the strong. So one of the funny things about the last couple of years is because we couldn't build new projects, big producers were generating a lot of cash flow from their existing production, and they didn't have a lot of place to build new things, so they ended up paying down debt and buying back some of their shares. So some of our bigger Canadian companies, Canadian Natural, Suncor, and others, actually are relatively strong. They're well positioned. Some of the smaller producers were just unable to access equity markets, and so they were at the margin already. And so I expect we'll see, independent E&Ps and especially the service sector, where this capital spending for an oil company means zero new revenue for a service company who is going to drill wells or things like that. And so they're the most vulnerable, and it's going to be very difficult to see companies surviving through this period.
So what's your read on how much the economy as a whole suffers as a result?
Well, I mean, it's a big part of Alberta's economy. So over 25% of GDP is related to the oil and gas sector. And as it's shutting down quickly its production, we still get a lot of production, so we still get a lot of GDP, but it's the incremental capital that's going to be shut down and all of the activity that we were hoping for. So it's going to hurt. I can't really say right now what that means, but it's going to be very painful, and there's just not a lot of options for companies. Probably a time for government to get involved, helping keep some of these companies afloat.
Well, and on that point, Texas regulators are said to be considering curtailment of oil production. How likely is the Alberta government to mandate further output cuts here?
Well, and we cut 325,000 barrels a day just over, it was probably 18 months ago now when we faced the big bitumen bubble here. And we've kind of still got curtailment in place, so there's probably 200,000 or 300,000 barrels a day that we would like to produce that we can't. We're too small to make a difference in the world. It's got to be something like Texas taking its production from whatever it is, 9 million barrels a day down to 5 or something to have a real difference. And if that happened, that would be a very positive signal that would allow Saudi Arabia and Russia to say, okay, we made our point, the U.S. is playing ball, let's get back to some normalcy. That would be good for Canada, but on our own, I don't think we have much capacity to influence the market.
Richard, real quick, last word from you. What's the likelihood of recovery at this point?
Well, we do know that most oil in the world cannot be produced at these prices. And so this cannot be sustained for the long term. The Russians and the Saudis are both relatively low-cost producers. They are government-owned companies. They have the backing of their governments. What they're trying to do is get the weak out of the market so they can get more market share. So that'll be, I really worry about Venezuela and Iran, countries that were already on the brink of destruction because of sanctions. So there's places in the world who are much more vulnerable than Canada. And in Canada and the U.S., it'll be, the strong companies buying the weak. Some hopefully get government support to get through the crisis. But that's kind of what we're up against right now.
Survival of the fittest. Richard, always appreciate getting your perspective, sir. Thank you kindly.
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity. Thanks.
Richard Masson is chair of World Petroleum Congress Canada. While the price of oil takes a toll on the energy sector, provincial coffers suffer too. University of Calgary political scientist Lisa Young on the latest